Hi, my name is David Wetton and welcome to the Conscious Leadership Now podcast. The intent of this podcast is to encourage you as a leader to embrace conscious leadership by giving you access to some of the world's leaders in the field of conscious leadership, both in practice and in thought. My heartfelt wish is that you leave this podcast feeling inspired with ideas to take away and implement in your business or organization to make a real difference in our world. And I'm pleased to say my guest today is Alex Edmans. Hi, Alex.
Hi, David. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Now, Alex is Professor of Finance at London Business School. He has a PhD from MIT as a Fulbright Scholar and was previously a tenured professor at Wharton and an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. Alex has spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos, testified in the UK Parliament, and has given the TED Talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, and the TED Talk X, The Social Responsibility of Business, with a combined 2 million views. He's appeared on Bloomberg, BBC, CNBC, CNN, ITV, Sky News, and Sky Sports even, and he's written for Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, and Wall Street Journal. And at Wharton, he won 14 teaching awards in 6 years. At London Business School, he won the Excellence in Teaching Award for the Best Professor across all programmes. He's been named to Poets and Quants, the Best 40 Professors Under 40, and is in the Thinkers50 Radar. Alex's book, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, headed the list of the Financial Times Business Books of the Month for March 2020 and was named to the FT's Summer Reads of 2020. And what sets Alex apart for me is his passion for purpose in business and for business to be run with the primary purpose of creating value for society. He uses his position in academic research to use rigorous research to influence business for the greater good of all, what he terms as pie economics. And he's also on the steering committee of the Purposeful Company Task Force, which was established in 2015 with the support of the Bank of England to transform British business with purposeful companies committed to creating long-term value through serving the needs of society. Now, in academic circles, there's this talk of, or there's a need for rigor and relevance, and this can be an insular journey. However, for me, Alex is out there in the world providing both for the greater good of all. So Alex, it's a great privilege to have you on the podcast, and I'm really looking forward to a fabulous conversation.
And I am too, David.
So that's take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, and it's my cue that it's time for you, Alex, to take 5, your take on 5 conscious leadership questions. So my first question is, what does conscious leadership mean to you?
So what conscious leadership means to me is a leader being conscious about her effect on wider society. So that could be the employees that she leads or the customers that she serves. Now you might think, well, shouldn't even an unconscious leader, so somebody who's purely focused on profit, still think about her employees? She wants to get as much work out of them as possible. Or her customers, she wants to extract as much business from them as possible. Well, that is true, but a conscious leader thinks not only about what she can get out of her employees and customers, but how much value she can deliver to them. So let me give you a couple of examples. So what do you deliver to your employees? Well, certainly important is pay and benefits, but also qualitative factors are really critical. So in my prior life, I used to be an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. And even when I was a first-year analyst, right at the bottom of the rung of the ladder, I was taken to meetings with the global head of investment banking and given the opportunity to present to the chief financial officer of a client. And this was huge in terms of my personal development as a banker, not just somebody who was able to do spreadsheets, but to present in front of a client. And also, what about how a leader thinks about her clients? Again, sticking with investment banking, I'm choosing this industry because it's often seen to be evil and value extractive, but you can deliver value for society. So what you're doing as a banker is you're a trusted advisor. A client comes to you with their biggest problems. Maybe they're in trouble because of the pandemic. They need money. Should they sell an asset? Should they raise equity? Should they issue debt? And you are trusted to give them the advice which is truly best for them, even if it doesn't maximize the fee income for yourself. And so that's, I think, what a conscious leader needs to do, is think about wider society around them, not just short-term profit.
Thank you, Alex. And just actually, having read your book on growing the pie, you talk about a number of, obviously there's the investors, but you talk about the other stakeholders as well. So how does a conscious leader actually address those different stakeholders in your view? And who are they?
Yeah, so stakeholders are any other aspect of society that a company has an effect on beyond its shareholders. So shareholders are important, right? A company does need to make profits for its investors, but also stakeholders more generally are important. And the whole idea of growing the pie, which is the theme of the book, is to actively think about what value can you create to your stakeholders. And that could be the value to employees by giving them the opportunity to step up, or delegating to them, or giving them some opportunities for skills development and mentorship. For clients, it might be doing things to help them, even if it's not necessarily going to lead to a deal or fee income. And for the environment, they might be ways of cutting your carbon footprint, even if you're already beyond the level that would avoid a fine. So it's to do things for intrinsic reasons, even if there's no clear instrumental benefit to your profits.
Thank you, that's wonderful. I agree. And another theme I think that comes out for me in this, which you highlight quite beautifully in the book, is about how it's taking a long-term stance. It's moving away from, I was an acting director in Barclays, and there's quite a lot of pressure at that time over just the quarterly results. And of course, your book talks of the importance of taking a long-term view on things. And actually, I think you talk about perhaps even taking decisions that are intrinsic, that may not make, inverted commas, common sense at that point from a profit perspective, but because they serve the greater good, a conscious leader can decide to take these decisions.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you might think, well, doesn't this sound a little bit fluffy? Can we really trust leaders to do things even if there is no calculable profit impact? So a lot of my work is to show that this is not just fluffy, it's actually good business sense. Because what does the traditional finance professor say in terms of making decisions is you do a calculation, right? Before I make an investment in a factory, I calculate how many widgets that factory will make and how much I can sell them for. And yeah, you can do that with a factory because the benefits are tangible, they're predictable. But many of the investments that we do nowadays, they are intangible. They are in things such as customer trust. If I turn down business, maybe they will realize that I'm a trusted advisor. They're going to come back to me later. If I give a junior employee the opportunity to step up, maybe that meeting won't go as well than if I was to do the presentation myself, but maybe we're going to be benefiting in the long term because the junior employee will develop his or her skills. But what my research will show is that these aren't just nice things, that they often do benefit you in the long term. So this is not just about being worthy or serving society, even though those things are important, but it's just good business sense to do certain things, even if you can't predict a profit outcome, because that profit income will manifest unexpectedly in the long term.
Thank you. And one who's grown up through, I mentioned to you before, through the business school environment, both Warwick and both Durham, and actually moved into roles like Barclays, where we've used value-based management, which you will be aware of, which looks at things at a longer term, but of course it looks at them from a financial perspective. So what would you say to someone who's listened to this and going, actually, this is really good, but how do I do it in practice? Because I know from at Barclays, it's strange, isn't it, Alex? Because when you say, oh, it's value-based management, we've got a figure to it, what people often don't realise is there's judgments behind those figures, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, just as there's judgments behind these more intrinsic things. So what would you say to someone, just to say what's one or two easy steps they can take to look at things from a wider perspective, not just the financials?
I think the first is courage, is that it takes courage to base decisions not just on financial numbers. It's like financial numbers are often a crux, right? We can take this decision and say it's backed up by a huge amount of analysis, but I think some of the most important decisions we take in life are not purely based on numbers, right? Why do you choose your spouse? It's not just based on his or her earnings potential, hopefully. And even when you choose a job, it's not only going to be based on the salary, but also the meaningfulness of the job. So I don't think it's unrealistic to take decisions in part on intangible factors. But then you might think, well, how do we make decisions? Is it just a free-for-all? Is it a black box? And so that's my second part of the answer, is that we can have some principles to guide us so that it's not just a free-for-all. And one of the principles that I focus on is the principle of materiality. So what do I mean by this? Is there's loads of stakeholders that a company can serve, but you can't serve everybody. They're going to sometimes be trade-offs. And what materiality highlights are what are the stakeholders that are most important to your company's business. So let's say you're a bank. Well, you might think, well, climate change is the order of the day. Let's spend everything we can in order to reduce our carbon footprint. But materiality might say otherwise. They might say even more important to your business than a low carbon footprint is customer trust. What we don't want to be in a payment protection insurance scandal or to have issues with data privacy. So if we have constrained resources, let's try to make sure we reallocate them first towards ensuring customer trust and data privacy and fair marketing and advertising. Yes, if we then have extra money left over, let's reduce our carbon footprint. But to have this priority structure is important. We can't be all things to all people. And that's part of consciousness as well, is to be conscious as to where are the biggest ways in which I can move the needle to help society.
Thank you. And it's a wonderful conversation to have with someone from a business school talking it from this wider perspective. And one other quick point on this, because when I read your book, one thing that came to mind to me, and it relates as well to, I'm going to call it just a traditional, for-profit business world that sees profit as the first and perhaps sometimes the only motive. But when we look wider from your perspective, one thing that came to mind was that when we make decisions, I thought of Edward de Bono and his six thinking hats. So he looks how people make decisions. So he has a white hat, which is facts and information, which I might argue is academic. You're looking at the evidence, you're looking to make differences. However, the interesting thing from his research is that most decisions are made using the red hat, which is about emotions and ego. That's what makes decisions at the end of the day. So how does this tally with, and we've also spoken off air about emotional intelligence. So how does the emotional intelligence come into this whole aspect of making decisions for the greater good of society, in your view?
Yeah, so I'm going to give the standard academic answer, which is a bit of both. And this is not a fence-sitting thing, but to say that the best decisions will take a variety of perspectives, right? There's obviously this big focus on diversity, but really what matters is cognitive diversity. We need decisions to be part head and part heart. So we can't have decisions being based purely on what you've called the white hat, the facts, because there's many important things which are just not captured in the numbers. For example, yes, we can think about how much we're paying our workers, and fair pay is important, but meaningful work and skills development are important as well. But we also don't want to go too far in the other direction and be purely based on emotion, right? Because there's a lot of evidence on behavioral biases and the fact that we can be affected by psychology. And indeed, some of my own work is on behavioral finance and the fact that psychology can lead us to make some wrong decisions. So indeed, my TED talk was in the idea of confirmation bias, which is like we like to go with our gut, but where evidence will help is it will ground us by showing that actually some things which gut feel might suggest don't hold up in reality. So sorry to use a rather crude example, but gut feel would say if a baby has diarrhea, you don't want to give him water because it's going to flow out the other end. But evidence will show that you actually do want to give water to a baby with diarrhea because it will help to rehydrate him. And so I think the optimal decisions will have a bit of both, the evidence to guide us, but also the acknowledgement that not everything can be reduced to a calculation. And that's where judgment and experience does matter as well.
Lovely answer, thank you. And just before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to, one thing that struck me was when you spoke in the book about confirmation bias, is how I myself can be guilty of this, because wanting to see business for the greater good of all, as you say in the book, I can use that phrase, research shows that, but of course, as you said, research can be handpicked. We can often find research that supports our views. And I think how you really helped me or continue to help me, is actually how, as you say, as well as the pie, you're looking around the whole pie of evidence, I'm going to call it, not just cherry picking, to use an analogy, of just the information you want to back your case, but really having a critical look at what's out there and what's going to make a real difference. Because I think if we can do that, then we have decisions, I think, that conscious leaders make that are really grounded as well. They're grounded in practice, and they're grounded in what I might call, hard hitting, truth, as well as this emotional aspect. So thank you.
You're welcome. I think that's important, is that we often I included, come to certain questions with our own prior views, but there will be dissenting views, and I think to actively try to seek those other viewpoints and to take them seriously. One phrase that Stephen Covey, in his book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, says is listen with the intent to understand, not the intent to reply, is to realize, well, there can actually be something that can be learned from a different perspective. It's not just something to defend against and argue against.
Thank you. And I'm saying one final thing, but one last thing that came to mind. You may not have come across him. There was a quantum physicist here in the UK called David Bohm, who, as well as being a very excellent quantum physicist, actually got into the realm of spirituality, so act as the advisor to Dalai Lama in Buddhism. But one thing David Bohm became known for was actually bringing together opposing views and saying, actually, when you bring together those opposing views, quite often something richer emerges. And there's a great book called On Dialogue where he describes his process, but it links into what you're just saying. Actually, if you funnel down one particular view, you can often miss not just views from other people, but when you bring that together, bring a much richer outcome to the table.
Absolutely, yeah.
So thank you, Alex. We may well have started on my second question. My second question is, how do you express conscious leadership through your work?
Yeah, so I'd say in 2 ways. One is through my research and writing, is to show that actually conscious leadership is good business. It's not just fluffy or worthy, but even for somebody like me, from a finance emotionalist perspective, I'm understanding that conscious leadership matters because the data suggests that an approach to business which is based on wider society and stakeholders is often more successful than one just based on profit. So that would be one in terms of my own research. But secondly, I would say I do this in terms of my teaching, because unfortunately, one of the sad facts about academia is that when you're evaluated for promotion or tenure, it's exclusively on the basis of research and publication. Yeah. So teaching doesn't matter. So if you wanted to be a self-interested professor, you wouldn't care at all about teaching. But this is something I get a huge joy from doing. I think the purpose of a professor is the creation and dissemination of knowledge. And so I'll try to put a lot of effort into trying to teach my students. And that could be in many forms. So one will be teaching them finance and trying to make sure it's engaging. Even the most boring financial concepts will hopefully be interesting, but also it's relevant. It's not just theory, but practice. And it also tries to incorporate some of the broader dimensions. So not just profits, but also purpose, as we've discussed. And indeed in my class, I have a big element where I teach them the importance of public speaking, of time management, of purposeful careers, and also mental and physical wellness, is to try to teach them many dimensions beyond just finance. Because if they come out of my class, and I think Alex has taught me the weighted average cost of capital so well, I can solve any problem and ace the exam on the weighted average cost of capital, I have not done my job. But if they said, well, he's taught me concretely about the importance of pursuing a career that affects, that is conscious about our effect on the world, as he's encouraged me to think about, well, how do I manage my time and how do I prioritize exercise and sleep and diet, then I do think I've achieved my job.
That's wonderful. And I want to ask, actually, because I really touched that passion, and having sat in a number of lecture theatres myself over the years, the enjoyment I sense of actually sitting in your lectures and having a more rounded view and a sense of a more rounded person. Where does that inner drive appear from you? Why do you do it in that way?
So I was really lucky in terms of my education. So I went to a Montessori school when I was young. And for those unfamiliar, like the Montessori school system is one where they're trying to be really broad in terms of the education that you get. So if we were to read the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, they would take us on a school trip to Canterbury, or we would learn about Hadrian's Wall and then go on a trip there. And you couldn't get an academic scholarship at the school. You could only get a scholarship in arts, music, drama, or sport. So they were all about this broad perspective. And that's something which has always stayed with me. So even though my job as a finance professor is sort of very academic, I love in my spare time doing things such as sports and music. And you might think, well, why did I come up with this interest in responsible business? That's not really a finance topic. It's often more a sociology or human resource management perspective, but I like to learn from different areas. And so that's why I'm drawn automatically to these interdisciplinary subjects.
Thank you for that. And it's almost like it's the story behind the story, which I think is so important to really connect with this human dimension, because I get a sense that when we're talking about, you can't really talk about, growing the pie, I think, without talking about the importance of human interaction, the importance of how we're living together in the world, particularly in the midst of these COVID times. I think this has really highlighted this situation. So thank you for that. My third question is that as a conscious leader, I think we spoke off air, many people talk about it being a journey, it's an ongoing journey. And on that journey, we come across teachers, we come across resources that really help us. So for you, in your journey, who for you has been an exemplar of embodied conscious leadership, and why?
So one is my boss at Morgan Stanley, a guy called William Chalmers, who's now the CFO of Lloyds, so he's left investment banking to go into industry. And why? Because you often think, well, the only way to become senior in an organization is to be really cutthroat and elbow everybody out of the way. But there was a time where he was in his third year as an executive director. He was coming up for promotion for managing director. And if there was ever a time to be short-termist, that would be the time to book a deal so that he would get the promotion to MD. So we were advising Abbey National at the time. And Abbey National had some financial problems and needed to raise money. And they were asking Morgan Stanley to pitch to them for the business of selling Porterbrook, their train leasing company. We were supposed to tell them why Morgan Stanley was the best bank to use. And he said, actually, don't use Morgan Stanley. In fact, don't use anybody, right? We don't think now is the time for you to sell Porterbrook. You wouldn't get a fair price for this. And Abbey National listened to the advice. They didn't appoint anybody. Then a few years later, Santander came in and made a takeover bid for Abbey National. And then knowing that William was trustworthy, they gave Morgan Stanley the entire defense mandate. So that was an example of acting in a trustworthy way when there was every incentive not to be trustworthy and to get the business. And William ultimately benefited unexpectedly in the long term because he got the takeover defense from Santander. But he could have never predicted that. Right? At the time he turned down the business, he would have had no idea that he would have been paid back many years down the line. But this goes back to the concept of long-termism that we've discussed earlier, is that often actions that might not be the most beneficial in the short term might benefit you in the long term.
That's wonderful. I was just looking at my notes here, because actually you do write in your book that Pi Economics believes an enterprise should serve society for intrinsic reasons, even if it couldn't calculate the profit increases from doing so, which is, you've just given a good example of doing that. He felt what was actually in the client's interest, what was right to do, as opposed to, you say, what would be right thing, or what would be profitable thing, we'd say, in this short-term moment for Morgan Stanley. And one thing I wanted to ask, because it came to me again from your book, and it surprised me, because quite often pharmaceutical companies are seen as being, one of the evildoers, should we say, through the profits they make through their drugs. But you gave the example of Merck, didn't you? And I might get his surname wrong, Roy Vagelos, who actually, didn't he, donated the drugs which so solved river blindness. And so I just want to hear just a little bit about that. And the other thing I think was, perhaps I want to hear your view on, there was a backstory to this in that you say that George Merck, who issued it, said that medicine is for the people, it's not for the profits. So in the DNA of that organisation, which I never realised, seemed to be a drive for what you were talking about. Would you like to share a little about that? Because that inspired me when I read it.
Yeah, so the pharmaceuticals industry is a controversial industry because there are some companies that can buy existing drugs and then hike the prices. And yeah, there are indeed some pharma companies that do that. But there are other pharmaceutical companies who are driven by solving the world's health problems. And I think Merck was an example. So it had this potential idea of developing a drug to solve river blindness. Now, at the time, river blindness was suffered by some of the poorest people in the world in Africa and Latin America. So if you were a profit-making company, you would not put your research and development efforts into river blindness. You might focus on some cosmetics for dermatology to sell to the movie stars in the UK and then the US instead. But they said, no, we're going to try this really risky idea of launching, of trialing this drug. And when the trial worked, and then they had a money spinner on their hands, well, they realized that the countries most affected couldn't pay. So Roy Vagelos decided to give this for free. And this seemed a crazy decision because it was something which sort of seemed to cost shareholders. But in fact, what it led to in terms of the benefits, in terms of employee motivation and reputation and so forth, meant that this was actually not at the expense of shareholder value.
Yes, that's right. So again, it comes back to earlier what we said in the conversation about, you know, reading round things and looking behind those motivations can actually, you know, it's brought a fresh viewpoint to me on this. And I understood as well from this benefit, I think it was Roy himself, part of the reasons he came to Merck was because of their reputation for, you know, having a passion for finding cures for people, not just making a profit. Which I think is really important. Right. And one thing I wanted to ask, I always get a question in my mind where I think all the listeners will want to ask Alex this. So your book speaks about growing the pie, and obviously how it says that, you know, ideally everyone benefits then, it's not just profit, but all the other stakeholders also benefit. What's your response in terms of, and I was looking up, we've got, haven't we, and I think one of the countries, might even be Holland, or I think it's one of the big cities in Holland, we hear the talk of donut economics, which says that the goal of thriving in balance. So you also need social, ecological foundation. We can't continue to grow the economy, we have to have a social and ecological stance. So actually the pie can't always continue to grow. What's your response to that?
So I agree with many of the ideas of the Donut Economics book, which is about serving wider society. But unfortunately, that book is not based on much evidence at all. So there it's very hand-selected, and they're not looking at rigorous studies. And so they take a very one-sided approach, which is to rant on capitalism and say, well, everything about capitalism is evil. And that has led to the book's success because it has had this partisan following. But I think the problem with this is with this approach is that it's too us versus them. So it has a very narrow definition of what the pie is. So it argues that the pie is financial wealth, and we can't grow financial wealth too much because we're going to overstep some planetary boundaries. But that has got a very narrow definition of what the pie is. The pie is not financial wealth, it is social value. So the pie involves things such as improving the environment, such as training workers, giving them the opportunity to step up. And when we have this much more holistic view of what the pie is, then I think it can be grown. But unfortunately, because that book pits sort of investors against wider society, it has this idea of let's try to make sure that people don't make too much money and so on. And that is quite popular in sort of this us versus them mantra. But the fact that it is, as you're saying, it is guiding policy in terms of this city in Holland, that worries me. Because some of the worst things that a company can do is not pay its workers too little or pay too little tax, but fail to innovate. right? So if Roy Vagelos had not invented this drug for river blindness, then hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, would still be affected by blindness. Some of the best ways in which we can serve society is through growing and innovation and not sticking with the status quo. And that's one thing I feel very strongly about. And that's why I do think that this idea of boundaries is actually really destructive for society.
Thank you. And I think it's really important. Thank you for mentioning that the pie has a much broader definition under what you're looking at. So I think that, I'm sure that was helpful to me, and I'm sure it will be to ones that the people that are listening. So my second part of this, you mentioned, you know, a couple of leaders here. In your own journey around this area, what resources have you found helpful?
Yeah, so I think in terms of a book, the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey is a book that I've really liked. And so that highlights the importance of the world around you and this aspect of being part of wider society, but in a concrete rather than fluffy way. And also it highlights the importance of focus, is that a company can't be all things to all people, but when he speaks in particular about time management and beginning with the end in mind, that helps the leader to think through all of the competing demands on her time.
Thank you. I love that. And that was one of the books actually that touched me on a stage on my journey, particularly I think, as you mentioned earlier, you know, seek first to understand and then be understood. I think is a very powerful thing around awareness, particularly for a conscious leader. It's been a very valuable resource, so thank you. Now, you'll be interested to learn, you probably know about this, Alex, so I will check with you, actually. So research, and this is academic research, and this is from Professor Jody Fry of the Texas A&M Business School. His research on spiritual leadership suggests that an inner life is the source of conscious leadership, where inner life is a form of spiritual or contemplative practice. It could be a reflective practice, which includes things such as walking in nature, meditation, prayer, etc. So in your journey, what practices have you found helpful and why?
So I found physical fitness and exercise to be extremely beneficial. So there's a lot of research on obviously the benefits of physical fitness for physical health, and obviously physical health is important for your effectiveness in the workplace. But what I'm particularly interested in is the effect of exercise on your mental health. And so on some level, some of this is obvious as it gives you a break from work, but I think what it also encourages is what I call self-efficacy. So the fact that it gives you this growth mindset, the idea that you can develop and improve yourselves. So there's many ways in which one can improve yourself. You can start to learn public speaking or become better at a musical instrument. And I love music, I play it myself. But they're the challenges that you don't have as quantitative measures of your improvement in public speaking or music. Whereas if you're running and you're able to run extra distances, or you're able to lift heavier weights, or the same distance with in less time, that just shows you the growth, and it shows that the progress that you can get in something which does involve some struggle. And I think this leads to something which is hugely empowering, which leads to the idea that we are not just born with gifts genetically, but we can develop them through hard work. And one thing I particularly like is group exercise. So I go to this brutal gym called Barry's Boot Camp in London, which people like David Beckham also go to, although he doesn't go to my branch. And there, what's good is that you're working with people around you. Now, often people think that sports are intensely competitive. Well, in a running race, if you do better, then somebody else does worse in terms of the ranking. But in a group fitness exercise, you're not really competing with anybody. Instead, what you're doing is you're leading just to a generally good atmosphere. So if I am doing some exercise, let's say I'm holding a plank, and I really want to give up because I'm in such pain, I want to make sure that I don't give up, because I'm going to be demotivating the people around me. I'm going to lead to them giving up as well. And so then again, this is part of conscious leadership, recognizing you're part of something wider than yourself, is the atmosphere of energy and pushing yourself that you're creating and delivering towards.
Thank you for that. Yes, and I do agree, this mental state, this aspect of physical fitness is so important. And I assume from your answer that you've run in the past, or you are a runner.
Yeah, so I used to run half marathons and marathons. So when I was a professor at Wharton, I was the head running coach of the American Cancer Society. So people who were raising funds for the American Cancer Society, I would coach them through that. And that was, again, a hugely gratifying thing. And what is great about running is I think it's many things. So one is that it is a race, but you're not racing other people. You're racing sort of your own time. You've got a target time. So the competitors are not competitors, right? They are participants in like a festival, like you. And so you can look around, and I would see the T-shirts that other people were wearing of the different charities that they were supporting, and that would encourage me. And there were people who would sometimes be walking because they were hurt, and then other runners would come and pat them on the back and give them encouragement. I think that was great. And I think another thing about running is it's a really fair sport. Is that if you think about football, which is a sport that I love, right? If you don't do well, you could blame the referee, or you could blame the opposition for cheating, or you could blame your teammates. Whereas running, it's down to you. Is that if you have a good time, it's due to you having put in the effort. And if you have a bad time, that's because you haven't put in the effort. And I, again, think this is really useful in terms of developing accountability and this idea of the growth mindset.
Thank you. And I'm sure you've experienced it too, because in my youth and slightly later years, I did a lot of running, and I've done London Marathon, a few half marathons like the Great North Run. But at times you must have experienced this, and I want to put it into your work, into business. There's this sense of what I call being in flow in running, where you suddenly realize actually you're running and you're not running because there's an ease to it. And why I relate it to that is sometimes I think probably in your academia or in people in business, when an idea or they're doing something for the greater good, sometimes they can be in that aspect of flow. So sometimes I think running for me can mirror this aspect of being in flow. So I don't know if you found that.
Yes, I absolutely do. Is that when you're running, is you sometimes just forget how far that you've run. Indeed, when I ran the Philadelphia Marathon in 2011, I knew that I was going to a conference in Chile later that year, and so I just listened to an audiobook of just to teach me Spanish. And so that was a great way of learning a language. Is that I was just forgetting about the running and just learning Spanish. And even though I hadn't spoken to a single Spanish person by the time I touched down in Chile, because I just listened to this book, I was actually able to converse in Spanish right immediately from getting in the cab and then getting to the hotel. So that was part of the flow, is that sort of just time sort of stood still, as that I could spend sort of hours running and listening to this audiobook without getting bored.
Thank you. And one final point on this, that just like your permission actually, just to dig just a little deeper on this question, because we mentioned before we came on, you mentioned that actually you do have a Christian faith. So I just wanted, if I may ask, what part does your Christian faith play in actually expressing what you're doing through your work, your involvement in this passion for societal value and growing the pie?
Well, thanks for asking that. So I don't think it was conscious in that I thought, oh, I'm a Christian and therefore I need to be doing research in responsible business. But I think just subconsciously that led to me wanting to research that rather than the weighted average cost of capital. Indeed, what's interesting is that what my research finds is that biblical principles are supported. So if you should help wider society, and if you do that, you benefit yourself, even though that was not the motive for doing this, and also to focus on the long term. And so what is really nice is that what I'm finding in my work is consistent with my faith, and that might be why I'm so passionate about doing the work that I do, and also spending a lot of time teaching it. And teaching is more broadly, it's not just teaching my students at London Business School, but coming on and being able to give this message to the listeners of this podcast, and this is why I'm passionate about doing those things.
Thank you. And I sense that, and coming from initially, from a Christian background myself, I just know that for me personally, that drove a sense of really wanting to make a difference and to be of service. And the strange thing I found, Alex, and I remember part of my service was out in the community and being on charities, but I always found actually when I particularly got out in amongst the charities that even though I thought, oh, I'm going to give here and I'll make a difference, do you know what? I always found I tended to receive more than I could ever give, just because being in the environment and what the other people brought to the table, and even the customers, users of the service, I myself learned so much through that service. And I'm guessing you must learn a lot through your students, and when you're involved in organizations such as, you know, the Purposeful Business, you're on the steering committee, although you're giving to that, I'm guessing also at the same time that you're receiving a lot as well.
Absolutely. I think these things are so intertwined, is that what you think might be service, and I think they are done for altruistic reasons, is that you do unexpectedly benefit. Is that if I was to give a talk on a certain aspect, maybe I get asked these interesting questions, and those questions were things that I haven't thought of. Sometimes those questions will be challenges, and for me to understand what are the challenges to my argument, make sure that I can strengthen the argument. So I think these things are intertwined, and this is why I do truly believe that actions that might be genuinely for giving reasons do benefit you in the long term.
Okay, so one just final quick one on this. So of your Christian faith, there's one element of that that actually helps you, I should just bring the words, helps you become present in what you're doing, that helps you actually serve better, to link into what we just said.
Yes, it does. So how does my Christian faith help? So I think it makes me grounded, is to think that there is a higher purpose in life. It also means that if I get failure, right, if I get a paper rejected or my book rejected or somebody doesn't like my class, right, I understand that this is not everything, is that there is what I believe to be a world and a purpose beyond just my financial and material success. I think through prayer, that is something which gives you some time to yourself and a time to be conscious every day, just like many people will meditate. I think just to have some time alone in some calm is really powerful. And I also think that Christian activities a lot will involve service and appreciation of others' talents. So within the Gospels, there's the passage about one body and many parts, and this means like the eye is not better than the ear, they just do different things. And this is to recognize that you're not better than other people, you just play a different role. And one of these things, I actually play for the church band at Holy Trinity Brompton, London, which is one of the main churches, and I play keyboards, but there might be times where there might be a solo for the guitarist, and maybe I actually want to strip back from this in order to allow the guitar to play the full solo. I could play the solo along and I might think I'm adding to the solo, but maybe no, actually I want to step back from this and allow my bandmates to have the greater effect. And I think that's something which is really important, is to realize that sometimes, well, actually less is more. There might be certain topics that I might not have expertise in. So one of the dangers with a professor is professors are often seen as talking heads who want to profess about everything, right? So now maybe artificial intelligence is a big thing, but often when I'm asked questions on that, I will say I don't have any expertise on this. And in contrast with something like responsible business, one of my main concerns is that a lot of people have started to jump on the bandwagon and say things about responsible business without doing the research behind it. And often that can lead to things which are consistent with confirmation bias. So if you say capitalism is evil, we need to completely rip up the system, people will agree with that, but that might not actually be backed up by the evidence. But just like I myself will say, well, if you haven't done research on responsible business, you might it might be better for you to not say stuff about this. Similarly, I need to take my own medicine. And if I'm asked about on a topic, well, I don't have expertise, I need to say, well, I don't have expertise on this, so I won't say anything.
Thank you. That's just a wonderful answer. And I love the way you bring in, I think with humility, this aspect of the importance of the research, but also link it with the practical elements of it as well. It's a beautiful mix. So I can see why your students rate you so highly. There's a very great human connection in here. So thank you. Thanks. So finally, given unlimited time and resources, what single thing would you recommend aspiring conscious leaders to do?
So I think here, a leader should ask the question, what is in your hand? So what I mean by this is what resources and what expertise do you have, and how you can deploy this to help wider society? Because we often think about responsibility as about do no harm, right? Don't pollute the environment and don't mistreat your workers. But I think responsibility is more about actively doing good. How can we use resources that we have at our disposal to serve wider society? So let me give a couple of examples. So one is Vodafone, the telecoms company, right? What they have is telecoms technology. But in 2007, they chose to use this to launch M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Africa, and that lifted 200,000 households out of poverty within the first 7 years. So you might think, well, money and banking, that's not part of Vodafone, but what they did is they used their communications technology to develop this. And again, this is why I do have issues with sort of this anti-growth ideas that if we think about growth and if we think about this in a too narrow way, that will stop some great inventions being made to serve society. And then at a personal level, right, so in the lockdown, I thought, well, as a professor, I'm not really doing anything really useful compared to the doctors and nurses or food delivery drivers who are helping out. But I thought, well, what is in my hand is that I've been really lucky to have had a lot of great sports coaches in my life. And so I can actually teach sports and fitness. And I've taught boot camps myself in Hyde Park before. What I realized is there's a lot of students at London Business School who were in lockdown, not doing much exercise, and might be sort of feeling sad that their final months at LBS were in a rather impersonal way in lockdown. So what I did is I did some Instagram workouts, live workouts, which brought the students together. So I would lead some fitness workouts and they would join in. And I think that was something that was appreciated. And it was a way of me giving back in a way beyond just teaching finance to the student community.
Thank you. And another great example. I really do love that. Thank you. And I have my, for those that listen will know, I have my Columbo question, which is my just one more thing question. And my just one more thing question is, please share your own resources and offerings which you feel would be helpful to those that are listening, and where they can get hold of them.
Thanks. So there's a couple of resources that I'd love to share. So one was, as you mentioned, I just released a book a couple of months ago called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. And so why did I write that book? Is that often people think that serving society is only worthy, it's a luxury that should be done when you have the money, but when you're in a pandemic, you should cut back. But what I wanted to show is, based on rigorous evidence, that serving wider society is not just worthy, it's good business sense, so that even hard-headed businessmen and businesswomen and investors should embrace this. And this is based on a lot of rigorous research, not just wishful thinking, but often this research will be written in academic journals for a very staid academic audience. I wanted to bring it to life in simple language with real-life case studies and examples and a practitioner framework, and make that accessible. So that's available on Amazon or any other website. But also I try to make, there's other free resources that I've done. So one other thing that I do, in addition to my London Business School job, is I'm a professor at Gresham College. So Gresham College is unusual, right? You can't do a degree there. All they do is they give free lectures to the public, just like Michael Faraday gave on science. And some of you will know Professor Chris Whitty, the government's chief medical officer, who's helping out in the coronavirus pandemic. He's actually the Gresham Professor of Medicine. I am the Gresham Professor of Business, and I've given 2 lecture series already. One of these is on how business could better serve society, about responsibility. And the other is called Business Skills for the 21st Century, covering topics like mental and physical wellness, time management, critical thinking and confirmation bias. And next year, it's going to be on the psychology of finance, on those behavioral biases. So if you go to my own website, alexedmans.com, or the Gresham College website, you will find those resources, which are free lectures. And for every lecture, if you don't have time to sit through a 45-minute lecture, every lecture comes with the notes, which is like the cheat sheet version, where you can take the key takeaways. So I hope that there will be a value to some listeners here.
Wonderful. I will put links to them in the podcast. And I'm going to also mention, I've mentioned before, your link to the Purposeful Company. I'll put a link to the website there, because I did look at the interim report, which I think was one of the first reports that came out of this steering group. And I really appreciate that report, because again, it had some research and some great information about purpose and how important it was, and the shocking cost it was just to the UK economy. was it 17, 18 billion potentially lost by not being on purpose, which really, you know, as you said, you know, when you look at the evidence, I love the fact there's evidence to support what we're talking about here. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. And I'm going to close actually, because it inspired me right at the end of your book, which must be the conclusion. I'm going to close with some words from your book, Grow the Pie, and encourage the readers actually to read this book. I think it's a really important book for our time. And you say this, which I found very inspiring. You say, it's up to all of us together to create a form of capitalism that works for all of society. We have the evidence to back us, the examples to inspire us, and the tools to put into practice. So let's make this vision a reality. And I absolutely love that rallying call, Alex. And thank you so much for being who you are. Thank you for showing up in the world of conscious leadership at London Business School and elsewhere in the way you do. And I've really enjoyed having you on the podcast.
I've really enjoyed the conversation as well. Thank you so much for the invitation, David.
Oh, you're welcome. So if you've enjoyed this podcast and my approach to conscious leadership, then please know that I help aspiring conscious leaders develop purpose-led, high-performing leadership teams through one-to-one coaching and tailored leadership programs. If you sense I can help you, then please look me up, that's David Wetton, on LinkedIn, and let's jump onto a conversation together. And finally, I truly believe, and finally, I want to thank all of those that are listening to this podcast. And if you're willing, please do share a link to this podcast with those you think would truly benefit from it. Because I truly believe that now is the time for conscious leadership. And with all the inspiring, heartfelt work you as listeners are doing, I have no doubt that conscious leadership will become a thriving reality, making a difference for the greater good of all. So until next time, I'll leave you with a blessing from John O'Donoghue. May the light of your soul bless the work you do with the secret love and warmth of your heart. And so it is.